Hey everybody, welcome to this week's show of YouTube Developers Live. I'm Jeff Posnick, coming to you from New York City. I'm a member of the Developer Relations team, and this week I'm really excited to talk to you about different ways of customizing the YouTube embedded player. Before I get started though, I want a couple of ground rules to kind of just talk about what we're going to be covering in today's show. There are a lot of different embedded players and there's lots of different ways to customize them, but for this particular show, we're going to be focusing on customizing the iframe-embedded player, which is our current recommended way of embedding videos on web pages. And we're going to specifically focus on the options that are most relevant for desktop web browsers. A lot of these customization options we'll talk about do have some effect with mobile browser playback, but not all of them do. And we're going to kind of just focus today on how these options affect desktop playback. Another thing that we're not going to be covering today is using the JavaScript API for controlling playback. This is obviously a very interesting topic and a very important topic. It's just a little bit outside the scope of what we wanted to talk about. So we're not going to be covering any of the methods that you could use in JavaScript to start playback or control playback or receive events when playback changes happen in the player. What we are going to be covering is things that are covered in the documentation on the specific page. So if we pull that up, we'll share that with you. And as I'm going through this demo, a lot of what I'm going to be covering refers to specific web pages. When we go back and post this video on YouTube, I'll have annotations linking to all the web pages so that you could go there and check them out yourself. So this is our main jumping off point for talking about the customization that you could do to the YouTube embedded iframe player. And you could get here from our main developers.google.com/YouTube documentation. And everything in this parameters section in the docs is fair game for what we're going to talk about now. One other thing before I actually get into explaining these parameters is explaining the two different types of ways that you can load the iframe embedded player onto your web page. And we're kind of agnostic as to the way in which you load it. These parameters are going to behave the same way regardless, but I just want to point out that there are two different ways of doing it. The first way is using the iframe's kind of like YouTube player, YT player constructor, and this is a more programmatic way of loading the iframe player onto your web page. So I have this JS fiddle right here that demonstrates what that would look like. It basically involves loading in this JavaScript API and calling the YT player constructor and passing in the ID of a div that's on your page. And you'll see here that there's this player vars section that you could pass in to the YT player constructor. So this is where you get to specify all the options that we're going to be covering today if you're using the YT player constructor. And just quickly jumping over here, this is where I stole that code from. In our Getting Started guide for the iframe API, we talk about how you could actually get that code. So feel free to borrow it from there or from that JS fiddle. The second way that you can load the iframe player onto your page is just with a simple iframe tag that you could add to any web page. And this has the same sort of parameters that the YT player constructor is. Kind of under the hood, they really end up creating the same thing, just that the YT player constructor is a programmatic way of creating this tag using JavaScript. This is if you're just writing out, an HTML template, or, even if you're not a JavaScript programmer at all and just want to include some HTML on your page, you could use this tag. And the same parameters that we're going to be talking about can go at the very end of the URL that you use as the source of the iframe tag. So over here we have autoplay equals 0 and controls equals 0. And that corresponds to what we're seeing over here for the player vars. And the actual documentation for using that iframe tag is found over here. If you look in the docs over here, we give some examples. So that's kind of the ground rules for how you actually will use these parameters that we're going to be describing in your own code. So I just wanted to run through pretty much from the top all these parameters here. We do have really nice explanations of what they mean in the documentation, so it's going to be a little bit repetitive in some cases, but I did want to highlight some specific ones that are the most useful. So Autohide comes in handy quite a bit. This is something that controls the behavior of the controls, more or less, that are on the bottom of the YouTube player. It's not necessarily the initial state of the controls, but it's more like what happens to the controls once playback starts. And I'm going to demonstrate the ways of setting those different values by going to this page over here, which is our YouTube player demo. So this is another really great resource, and it's kind of an alternative to, you know, writing this code over here or writing this in JS Fiddle. It's just a way to kind of play around with these parameters in a live setting. And you can kind of think of it like our API Explorer, if you've ever used that for our data APIs. This is the equivalent for our player APIs. So what it lets you do is go over here on the right and start choosing different values for the parameters. And I mean, I'm not going to do this for every single parameter that we're going to talk about, but just to show you how you could experiment in real time without having to write any code. Let me just try setting Autohide to 0 over here. I'm going to click Update Player. And once I begin playback, you can see this is a very old video. Actually, part of what I'm planning on doing is replacing the default video that we use in this demo with this video. So we'll have a very meta experience if you happen to be watching this while on the demo page trying out these parameters. So the main thing to keep in mind, though, is that the controls at the bottom over here did not disappear during playback. And if I were to go over here and change the Autohide to 1, update player, this is loading in the player with the parameters. You'll see that when I mouse over, the controls are there. When I move the mouse away, the controls disappear. So for experiences where you want maybe more of a lean back type situation where people aren't going to be interacting with the controls, or you don't want the controls to overlay the video playback, that's a very useful parameter. Autoplay is next on the list alphabetically. Somewhat self-explanatory. If you add in the autoplay parameter, then the video will start playing back as soon as the page, or as soon as the iframe embed is loaded on the page. I'll give a quick demo of that over here, and this time instead of using the player kind of player demo page, I'm going to use that JS Fiddle that we have set up, and I'm going to just change the autoplay value to 1. I'm going to click Run, and you can see here's the embed. It started playing as soon as the page loads. So there's certain scenarios where that's useful, certain scenarios where it's not. You kind of have to use your judgment as to whether autoplaying is the right thing to do. CC load policy is something that controls whether closed captions or subtitles are displayed by default. And the default behavior, if you don't set anything for CC load policy, is that the user's preferences, basically on YouTube, there's a way of going in and saying whether you want closed captions or you don't want closed captions. That's normally what takes effect. If you have a specific video and you know that you always want the closed captions to be shown, you could set CC load policy to 1. Color is a bit interesting. It's not something that I see widely used necessarily, but there are some cases where you might want a little bit of flair, let's say, in your player, and you don't want the default behavior. So I'm going to go to the player demo page really quickly and just show you what it does. You can set color to white instead of red, and you update the player. Controls should look slightly different depending upon whether they're red or white. So it just basically changes the branding a little bit on the player. Not necessarily the most useful thing in the world, but it does give you a little bit more control. Speaking of control, next item alphabetically is controls, and this is actually quite useful. There are cases where you could actually see a lot of performance benefits by changing this value from the default to a specific option, which is 2. We have a note in the documentation kind of explaining more about what this does, and if you read the note, it says that controls 2 can give you a performance improvement over the default behavior. And the reason why that is controls 2 kind of has a way of loading the iframe-embedded player that does not initialize the underlying Flash player by default. It doesn't initialize it until you actually click on the video thumbnail to start the playback. This obviously only applies to playbacks that do involve the Flash player. The iframe player might decide that HTML5 video is going to be used instead, in which case isn't quite as important. But in situations where Flash playback is being used, you could really see a significant performance benefit from setting controls too. And that might be the default that we use at some point in the future, as mentioned here, as soon as some UI issues are kind of worked out. I'm going to give you an example of how you could see that performance benefit. It mainly comes across when you have, let's say, I don't want to say a specific number, but if you have multiple iframe embeds on the same page. So this one over here has, I don't think there might be 50 from the Google developers channel. So the first thing that we're going to look at is the behavior pretty much by default, where there's controls 1, or if you leave out controls, it's a default. And it can take some time for these underlying Flash players to all initialize, and can add some latency to the point where things look like they're ready to be interacted with on the page. So not necessarily the best user experience. If you take the same thing and you change it to controls equals 2 explicitly, then you should see a much better performance. It's quite remarkable, actually. So what's going on is, again, it's just loading in these thumbnails. It's not initializing the Flash player for each video, and you could have, I don't want to say you should put thousands of embeds on the same page, but if you do happen to have a large number of embeds on the page, you will see a difference. So very important to keep that in mind. A few other parameters that are not necessarily as exciting. There's keyboard support for the ActionScript player. I'm not really sure why you'd want to turn this off. I think it's actually kind of nice to keep it on, but we do have the option of turning it off if you want. This particular parameter is quite important, the enable JSAPI. And what it lets you do is ensure that you are able to talk to the iframe player on the page using the JavaScript API. So as I mentioned, we're not actually going to be covering anything about the JavaScript API in this particular session, but plenty of people have used it. And the one case where you really need to be sure you're explicitly setting this is when you're writing the iframe tag directly to the page. So kind of like this. Because when you're using the YT player constructor, it pretty much will be set automatically for you by default. Just because by virtue of the fact that you're using JavaScript to initialize the player, chances are you're going to want to talk to the player with JavaScript. So it always gets set for you, but that's not the case if you explicitly are writing an iframe tag to a page. So you really do need to make sure there that you have enable JS API set to 1, and that's necessary in order to talk to the iframe player. The end tag, and a little bit further down the alphabet, is start. So these are two corresponding tags. This gives you a really easy way of putting an embed on a page that has this custom end time and a custom start time. So if you have a 3-minute video and you really want to embed 30 seconds in the middle of the video, you could use those two tags to do it. As soon as it reaches the end, playback reaches the end tag, playback will effectively stop. So that can be useful. FS parameter, not super useful anymore. Basically, it lets you control whether there's a full screen button on the ActionScript 3 player, but I don't think it has effect on the HTML5 player. So not really sure why you would want to change that. IV load policy is something that controls whether, I guess, interactive video annotations is, for lack of a better way of describing it, is shown on your video by default. So there's a couple of different values over here. It's 1 or 3. Basically, setting it 1 will make sure that those annotations are shown. Setting it to 3 will make sure that they're not shown by default. But at any point, the user can change the setting explicitly in the player if they want to show or hide the annotations. List is a really interesting one, and there's quite a bit to talk about with list. So I'm actually going to defer at this point to a whole blog post that we put together to talk about the different types of values that the list parameter and the list type parameter, which is an associated parameter, can take. I'll link to this blog post in a video annotation so you can read it in more detail. But the long and short of it is that it's a really easy way to take a simple embedded player on your page and use that to display a list of videos without having to hard code the video IDs in advance. So you could have one specific player on your page and say, play back the most recent videos from a specific YouTube channel, or a specific playlist, or a specific search term even. So you could say, this is an embedded player that will show the latest videos that match the search term YouTube API, something along those lines. It's quite useful. I don't think as many people know about it as they should, so hopefully people will watch this and start using it a little bit more. List type goes hand in hand with list parameter. There is a loop parameter, and the loop parameter will, as explained in the documentation, allow you to automatically restart playback of a video when the playback is ended. You kind of have to have a little bit of a hack if you're trying to do this for a single video where you create a playlist that has only one video entry in it. So we have a little bit more info there. Modest branding is something that's covered in a different blog post, which we will also link to from the annotation. And it talks about the option down here at the bottom. It's not exactly a fully logo-less player. There still is a YouTube logo involved that shows, I think, on the pause screen in the upper right-hand corner, or in the queued screen. But it is one parameter that you could set to kind of tone down the YouTube branding on the player. And that's something that you might want to keep in mind if you have a scenario where you want to embed but don't want to make it fully YouTubed. The origin parameter is something that can be used when you are using the iframe embed tag and you're going to be interacting with the iframe embed using JavaScript. So as mentioned before, you might want to explicitly put in the enabled JSAPI. You also might want to put in the origin parameter over here, and you set it equal to the full URL for your web page. And this is a kind of a security mechanism to make sure that only JavaScript that's run from your host web page is able to talk to the player. And if you're using the YT player constructor, it gets set automatically for you. So this is another instance where you really only have to worry about this when you're explicitly writing out an iframe tag. And sometimes people run into issues where they're explicitly using the iframe tag and they're trying to talk to it using JavaScript, but their code just isn't working. One thing to debug in that case is check to see whether you are setting the origin parameter, and if you are, make sure that it's really set to the full URL of the host name for your site. Player PID, this isn't really relevant anymore. It's more of a way of using the older JavaScript API for identifying your player. There's a playlist parameter, which is easily confused with the list parameter, and it is something that actually takes in a different set of values. The playlist parameter takes in a list of video IDs. So this does not have to be a real playlist that exists on YouTube. It doesn't have to be anything that is the uploads from a specific channel. It could just be a list of any video IDs that you want. And it's kind of a way of generating a dynamic on-the-fly playlist. So some use cases where that might be useful. There's the rel parameter, and this controls whether or not the end screen of a video will display related videos or not. Most folks are familiar with the fact that once you reach the end of a YouTube video, you'll see some configuration of thumbnails with suggestions for other videos to play. We do have the ability to turn that off if you feel like you do not want that on your embeds. Showinfo is something that will control what is displayed initially in the queued state. There's ways of taking the default behavior and kind of toning it down a bit, again, where you don't see quite as much before the video starts, and you could set show info equals 0 if you want that. Show info is actually used in another case, and that's when you're using the list player, and explicitly setting show info equal to 1 will make it so that there is a list of queued videos in the playlist in your list player. So if we look over here, this is a case where show info is set to 1. This is a playlist player that's loading everything from Google developers. And you'll see before playback has even started, you have this handy thumbnail for all the videos that are kind of queued up in the playlist for the next videos, and it lets you choose what you want to start with. So it is actually quite useful for scenarios where you're doing the list player. start parameter we really covered before, and hand in hand with the end parameter. And the last one is the theme parameter. This is something similar to that earlier color parameter that just lets you change the default way that the player looks and gives you some degree of customization in that regard. There are now a couple of deprecated parameters. I'm not going to cover those. They're deprecated for a reason. We don't want folks using them anymore. I wanted to point out that there are occasionally, I don't want to say rumors, but they're kind of like certain parameters out there that people pass around and say, hey, you could use this player parameter to force HTML5 playback, or use this player parameter to force playback in a certain quality level, or something along those lines. Those aren't documented for a reason. We really do not want people to use parameters that aren't explicitly mentioned in the documentation, partly because we're not fully committed to supporting them. They might sometimes work in some cases, and they might stop working at any time in the future. So we really don't want people to build things that rely on those parameters. And there's also just cases where we want control to be in the hands of the person who's viewing the embed. So we want control over the default playback to really lie in the person who's using the web browser and might have Flash enabled, or the default auto quality for the quality level in many cases gives the best playback experience. So if you don't see something listed as a supported parameter, please don't use it. And if you do happen to find some parameters, please don't complain if they ever break at some point in the future. I guess that's the main takeaway. That covers the list of all the supported parameters. We had a lot of different web material here, and be sure to check out the annotations on the video for links to everything that we covered today. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see everybody next week. Cheers.